This is House Education, Wednesday, March 11. Going to spend a little bit of time refamiliarizing ourselves with foundation formula concepts, and then really talk a little bit more in depth as to how those translate to the map that we've been looking at, and how it might for any future map we take up. I think the best course of action might be to sort of do a rapid fire through the overall presentation that you have, and then move into questions, and we can move into some of the modeling that's been done. If that works okay for you.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
All right, for the record, Ezra Holden, Joint Fiscal Office.
I'm Julia Richter, JFO.
And is it okay if I share the screen?
Yes.
Well, Ezra's pulling that up, I guess we'll just say we put together these slides to serve as a review. If it's too detailed, let us know. We can come back out of the weeds, or deeper into the weeds where we're most comfortable. Let us know.
All right, so as Chair mentioned, we are going to do a overview of the Act 73 as enacted foundation formula, and then move on towards the materials that were provided by us this morning. Just as a reminder, Joint Fiscal Office, nonpartisan legislative office. We're here to provide you with information and to not make policy recommendations. So first, just want to go ahead and do a quick refresher of foundation formulas in general. So never get this control bar all the way out of my content. Okay, so just as a reminder, long-term weighted average daily membership, that is a term that you will see quite often in this presentation. You'll also see the term long-term average daily membership. So the abbreviation LTWADM and LTADM are ones you're familiar with. And so that is the student count that in a foundation formula drives the funding to a district. So that is a long-term ADM membership. So the students of the district and any pupil weights that they have. Those two combined are how you get to the long-term weight ADM. Some pupil weight abbreviations that you should also be familiar with are FPL, Federal Poverty Level, which stands for our students experiencing economic disadvantage. We also have EL, which are the English learner students. So those are important to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that Act 73, the weights are additive. So if a student is a FPL student and an EL student, you would add those two on top of each other. All right, so broadly, the foundation formula will apply a base and weights, which are typically based on the student's characteristics, such as FPL, EL, etc. And so the student characteristics to a student population to determine the funding that a school or district would receive. So with Act 73, we're talking about the funding that the district would receive. And so that calculation would be the base times the long-term weighted average daily membership of the district. And that's how you calculate the educational opportunity payment, or EOP. There are also support grants for small and sparse schools that would be added on top of this if a school qualifies. All right, so now we've looked at foundation formula briefly, overview broadly of foundation formulas. We'll now move to the Act 73 foundation formula. So just want to highlight that under Act 73, we have a base amount of $15,033 per long-term ADM. So that is the long-term membership of a pupil without any pupil weights. Act 73 also allows for students to receive weights based on any demographic characteristics such as FPL or EL. And those weights are based on the Colby and Baker memo released in April of 2025. And so among other things, these weights would replace the special education census block grant and replace them with tiered weights based on disability category. Act 73 also would replace the small school grant, the small school weight and the sparse school weight with school support grants instead. And you can see here a table going into more details of the different weights.
Can we take questions as
Please,
usual?
no, jump in.
Okay, I'm just wondering if you could give me a better idea of the difference between the small school and sparsity weights versus the grants. It's that it's not based on number of kids, it's just a flat number.
So I have some more information on the next slide.
Okay.
That is maybe helpful. And then if you still have a question, we can revisit. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So yep, so here we have the Act 73 small school and sparse school support grants. So under Act 73, the small school support grant has two criteria. First is that the average enrollment over 2 years is fewer than 100 pupils at that school. And the second is that it is considered a small by necessity school, which is currently pending definition. And I will note that this grant applies to the school's membership rather than the membership of the district. And so that would be about $3,157 per qualifying pupil at that school. And next we have the sparse school support grant. And so this is, again, based on two criteria under Act 73. So first, it is a school within a city, town, or village with a population of fewer than 55 people per square mile. And also it needs to be deemed sparse by necessity. Again, that's a definition that is currently undefined. And so the qualifying students at that school would receive for every student at the qualifying school, you would receive $1,954. One difference in the sparse school grant versus a weight is that we're looking at sparsity at the town, school, or town, city, or village rather than at the district level.
And I think one other piece to keep in mind when thinking about the provision of a grant versus a weight. Under current law, we have those small and sparse weights. And we have other weighting categories as well. Because those are tax capacity weights and they're not weights in a foundation formula, it's not an apples to apples comparison to look at what weights we have in current law versus what weights would be used in the foundation formula, because current law is adjusting taxes and tax capacity. As Ezra mentioned, the foundation formula is adjusting funding directly going to schools. And so these amounts, while they're grants, it's a different fiscal mechanism. So too, if you're looking at the calculation of the education opportunity payment, each one of those weights included in the calculation of the EOP is also associated with a funding amount. It's just not a separate grant. It's all built into the EOP.
Aaron, then Rob.
Are these two additive?
Yes.
You could have one or you could have both. I'm confused by sparse by necessity. How? I guess, and that's not necessarily, that's, I think, probably a question for us in the creation of it. Like, I understand, obviously, details matter, small by necessity, but
So
sparse by necessity feels, it's confusing to me.
I think it just needs sparse, just sparse.
Right, like
Yeah.
are you,
Right.
So it absolutely is a policy choice. There is a sparsity weight that exists in current law, the tax capacity weight. And that the determination of that sparsity as an additional funding category or tax capacity weighting category stems from the original research done by Doctors Colby and Baker, and then again in the memo, which identified that there was a significant additional cost difference associated with the provision of education to students in geographic sparse areas. So it could be like the copies of scale, which of course is also related to small school. It could be additional transportation costs, pieces like that.
I mean, about that same thing.
Well, I had the same question, but I think it's just, you wouldn't be sparse by necessity, just sparse, right? You'd be small by necessity because your school's at the boondocks.
Actually, that's something is sparse.
Yeah.
Right.
It's geographic isolation.
It's geographic, right, but I mean,
know,
like,
it makes
but
sense.
it's the words by necessity, sparse by, I think it's just sparse, sparsely populated. I think that was what you were saying, right? It just.
Well, yes, and then I guess I'm trying to understand that. So the small school support grant applies to just the kids in that school, regardless of what district construct we end up at. The sparse school support grant would be by the town of residence.
Be by the students in that sparse town.
Right.
Under
Yep.
current law, the sparsity weight is based off of the entire district. So if you had a district that fell into the categories of X number of people per square mile, then regardless of if there was like a city in the middle of that sparse district, the students in that city would too receive a sparsity weight. This was a policy decision to narrow the definition of sparsity to the students that are in a school that is deemed sparse. Is deemed sparse based off of these two criteria.
And are these grants to independent schools as well, or is this only to public schools? How does that piece of it work? Because right now they're weighted regardless of which system they currently get, right?
I'd like to phone a friend in Large Council.
Save that question.
Write it down. So, okay.
Okay, so that was the quick review of the foundation formula. Be good to move forward.
Yes.
Okay, so supplemental district spending. This is also contingently effective. Also created in Act 73, and this is that provision where school districts have the option to ask voters to approve what is called supplemental district spending. Those are voter approved funds that are in addition to the foundation formula amount, the EOP, and the grants that Ezra just spoke about, and other categorical aid. So upon approval from the voters in that school district, a district would be permitted to have supplemental district spending of up to, this is a cap, 5% of its long-term membership. So that's its unweighted student count multiplied by the base amount of the same fiscal year, right? So that's that 1533 adjusted by inflation. There is a transition provision. So in the first years of the foundation formula, it starts at a higher cap and then it phases down over time to this statutory cap of 5%. This is the tax mechanism. We won't go into it into much detail unless that's helpful, but essentially the way I'm seeing the chair shake his head. Do you want me to just skip past the slide?
No, you just do it, you don't need to go into detail.
Okay. So the way that supplemental district spending is raised is through a local property tax that is still equalized across the state.
Right.
So essentially, all school districts will be able to raise the same amount on the same tax rate regardless of their property wealth. And the way that this works is essentially the state looks at all of the school districts and the grand list per pupil in each of the school districts and looks at how much could be raised in that school district that has the least property wealth per pupil and says that's what everybody can keep on their tax rate. The remainder is recaptured by the state. And flows to a supplemental district spending reserve. And this gets into that piece, which I know is included in the district builder, which is looking at that grand list per pupil of districts. So the wider the range of the grand list per pupil of the districts, using this tax mechanism, the more funds are going to be recaptured of the richer property districts and flow to this reserve. And Act 73 directs that the amount in the supplemental district spending reserve is then used in the following year to uniformly lower property tax rates.
And again, just conceptually, if every school district had the exact same grand list, there would be no reserve created because everybody would have the exact same capacity.
Also, if there's only recapture if school districts opt to have supplemental, to vote on supplemental.
That's right.
Which they may
That's right.
say, we're not going to do that because of all of our grant list.
And yes, both points. And I would say the other piece that I think is important to keep in mind too, is that unlike in the current system, where one school district's increased spending has a ripple impact into all other property tax rates. In this mechanism, the supplemental district spending tax, that is localized solely to the districts that are choosing to have and voters approve the supplemental district spending. Is it
Then, assuming the impact of that in terms of what property taxpayers are paying is greater in districts with higher grand list values, right? Like you're paying more to get access to supplemental spending.
I would say it depends on how you look at the impact, right? In the communities that have higher property values, yes, the property bills will be bigger. Of course, because the base it's a bigger base at the same rate it's being applied to. It's a question of, is the amount, what should be compared? And this is a policy choice. Is it the amount paid, the overall bill, or is it the equalized tax rate?
That policy choice has already been made, or is one we need to make?
Was everything that we've walked through to this point have been included in Act 73. So this equalization mechanism that we are talked about, this is all in Act 73. It is contingently effective. Of course, you could make a decision to change it, but it would be amending Act 73 as passed.
All right, so as Julie mentioned, we've been talking through Act 73 as enacted, and now want to pivot a little bit to talking about the Act 73 foundation formula and the modeling that was done as if it were implemented in fiscal year 2026.
So this speaks to the other document that we have, which was modeling as if it, just as we said, fiscal year 2026 for the district boundaries that were on our draft map.
So if Act 73 were to be implemented in fiscal year 2026, the base and support grants would be increased to account for inflation. You'll recall that the Act 73 as enacted number, those were the dollar amounts for fiscal year 2025. So now we are one fiscal year in the future. So we would have to adjust for inflation. In Act 73, that is done by using the NIPA price deflator. So after adjusting for NIPA, the fiscal year 2026 base amount would be about 15,456 per a district's long-term average daily membership. And I think it's important to note here that the pupil weights themselves are not adjusted by inflation. So yeah, so you'll recall that your EOP, if you're a district, is determined by your long-term weighted ADM, which is the long-term, your membership of kids in your district, plus any pupil weights that those kids bring with them. And then that summed up figure is then multiplied by the base. So the weights themselves don't change, but all else equal, since the base is increasing, your EOP would therefore be increasing. Also, the school support grants are updated by NIPA for fiscal year 26. So that sparse school support grant would now be about $2,009 per eligible student. And the FY 26 small school support grant would be about $3,246 per eligible pupil.
So I think I'll just briefly interject here. And I know that Ezra is about to talk about this. Obviously, the foundation formula didn't come into place in fiscal year 2026. And we heard the request of need for modeling, need for numbers. And so this is sort of using the policy decisions that have been made thus far and using the best and most recent available data, which is FY 26. What can we show you? And so that's sort of what we're laying out here and talking about how things would be implemented in FY 26. Obviously, we're in the middle of it. But that's why we're walking through all of these pieces. And I know that the last time I was in here, we spoke a lot about the challenges of modeling, and we recognize the need to see numbers. So this is trying to get as close as anyone can get at this point.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice segue into the Act 73 modeling considerations. So there are many considerations that went into this and that we would like to highlight. So first of all, you have some data considerations. So the JFO modeling was made using some incomplete and suppressed data. And that's due to the nature of Vermont as a state. When you have small population groups, once it gets below a certain number of students, below 11, we have to have that data suppressed. So for example, the EL weight was modeled using a flat 1.39 rather than the tiered weights that are in Act 73. Likewise, the special education weights, which are also based on disability categories, those we did not include in the EOP at all because of that data suppression. Also, I think it's worth pointing out that the AOE enrollment data that we have currently been able to access for our sparse and small school calculations does not include pre-K enrollment. At this point, we cannot determine what impact this data would have, but we assume that there would be some impacts. Also, just under Act 73, pre-K enrollment is not excluded from small or sparse support grants. So we assume that it would need to be accounted for when determining the support grants.
And to that end, too, and I know that this is where one of the places where Ezra is going, pre-K hasn't been fully decided yet. Right? It's one of those big outstanding questions. So this is an example of based off of policy choices that are still to be made regarding pre-K and a number of other pieces that haven't been made yet. This is one place. There are others. This is one place where the decision of pre-K, where decisions around pre-K may impact the fiscal picture of Act 73 and how much school districts would or would not receive.
So in addition to some data considerations, there also are some modeling caveats that we'll raise as well. So there are significant assumptions that went into this modeling, and so you should interpret the results with some caution. Change to any one of those assumptions would change the result of the modeling. So we've mentioned this already. It uses fiscal year 2026 data and reflects estimates if Act 73 were to have been implemented during fiscal year 2026. Also on your printouts, you'll see that we have fiscal year 2026 education spending as approximate, and that's because in the House map proposal, there are a couple of current law districts which were split between proposed districts. And so to try and assign the dollars of those split districts, we chose to use the estimated share of the long-term weighted ADM of those current districts and then assigned it to the town. So I think Montpelier Roxbury is one of the districts that split. So we tried to assign okay, Montpelier had this share of the long-term weighted ADM under current law, so we will assign them a similar share of that current district's budget. So just keep that in mind when you're comparing the current education spending of FY 26. That's why it's listed as approximate. Also, this modeling does not include the transitional supplemental district spending that Julia spoke about. You'll recall that with supplemental district spending, a district could vote to spend above their foundation formula amount. And there is a transition period in fiscal year 29 through 33 where they can spend up to 10% above. So that is not reflected in the printouts, just the 5% statutory figure that they transition to in fiscal year 2038. And finally, you'll note towards the bottom of the printout that there are interstate districts, Interstate 1, Interstate 2. This was done for informational purposes. They're left on the sign in the House Ed map policy, but to just account for their current spending and the long-term membership, we've labeled that there, but that's just for informational purposes. And there are also outstanding policy questions within this modeling. So sparsity and small school grants are included in the estimates on your handout. However, the definition of sparse by necessity is outstanding, and having a definition is critical for finding the analysis. Similarly, the term small by necessity is also undefined. For our analysis, we tried to have a proxy definition for that small by necessity, and that is by using the measure of sparsity. So fewer than 55 people per square mile at either the town, city, or village where the school's located. So the measure we're using for sparsity. We tried to use that as our proxy for what is small by necessity. A different definition of small by necessity will be important for refining this analysis. And also the decisions around other policy questions, which we have on the next slide, are important for this as well. So assuming that all else policy-wise is held equal, and we're not attempting to predict any changes at the state or local policy level, some of the big items that are outstanding for policy decisions are CTE, pre-K, school construction, and other categorical aid or funding decisions.
Yeah, and I would add to that list, special ed, which is not specifically called out because you called it out earlier. But I think it's still a major policy question whether special ed is funded in a grant or in a weight. We've heard a lot of conversation about that. But so as we go to the modeling that you'll see, recall that it does not include special ed.
And before we move off of this slide, I think it's helpful to put an exclamation mark next to this slide in terms of what is and what isn't included. We had to do some sort of comparison because that's what's been needed, that's what's been requested. And it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. To the extent that it's an apples to apples comparison, or an apples to oranges, or an apples to grapefruits, depends on all of the choices that you all still need to make. So dependent on, how CTE is going to be determined, that will impact how the columns and the funding levels of each district shake out. It could be an apples to apples if you decide to not give any additional funding to CTE in no way. Or if you decide to add additional funding to CTE on top of the education opportunity payment, then that would be factored in once that decision is made.
So I think the high level takeaway for these last several slides is that when you think about all the caveats, considerations, outstanding policy questions, you should view this as a preliminary analysis, not something that is set in stone and not something that's definitive, just an estimate of Act 73 based on these criteria and parameters. And so that's time for questions.
Everybody feel like you have a good understanding, at least for the time being?
Yes.
All right, so why don't we walk through some of the modeling and I guess I would say, don't be afraid to remind us of the caveats and considerations that you.
Linear.
So if you want to go ahead, it is the printout that shows on the committee page.
Yeah.
Looks like this. Do you want us to share it on our screen or do you want us to just talk big picture about what?
Probably talk big picture, only, we can't see
That's
it.
what I think, yeah. Ready to do a run through? Okay.
So before you start, Rep. Brady is the one who requested the modeling. Do you want to just set any context here?
I'm not really, other than I guess, I'm continue to be concerned that I don't fully understand the nexus between policy decisions and map work in our committee and the foundation formula. And a concern about a bit of the sequencing and that these decisions or the impact of the foundation formula is likely very consequential for much of the field. And since we haven't been talking about those so much in this committee, I was trying to understand much better kind of what a future state might look like and whether some of my concerns were potentially borne out in modeling to the extent that we can do it. And in my own strong desire to fully understand what does the foundation formula mean for our state.
And I might just add that as we look at this, there are two sides to the equation here. You're going to see, I think, some impacts that are concerning. But I would just remind us all that those also relate to lower property taxes, which is a concern we don't talk about much in here, but it's one that it's out there in Vermont land.
Ask a
Yeah.
silly question. So when we're doing this comparison, special education funding is not included at all in the modeled number, but it is included in their previous number?
Do you want to go ahead and give your big picture talk?
Yeah.
That's
That's a small picture one, but I'm
Well,
just.
no, I think it's part of
Differences, and that could be a lot.
It's very important, but it's part of this.
Very important. We'll definitely come back to
Okay.
it. The answer is kind of,
Kind of, okay.
and we can explain that more, but maybe first Ezra can walk through high level, just what you're looking at in each of these columns.
Yeah, just to orient everyone, I've put at the top for reader assistance column letters. So in column A, we have the new district column based on the House Ed map proposal. Column B lists the counties that AOE has assigned the current law districts to. Column C is the current law districts that are being wrapped up into the House Ed map proposal. So column D is the estimated aggregate. Remember, we talked about that's estimated aggregate education spending based on this current law districts.
You want to remind what education spending means?
Yeah, so education spending are the expenditures at a district less the offsetting revenues that a district receives.
So that's essentially saying, what is the school district's total budget minus all of those funds it's getting from the federal government, minus all of the categorical aid like special ed, the special ed grant that they get, universal meals supplement, flexible pathways, those kinds of pieces.
Okay.
Those are the offsetting revenues that Ezra was talking about. And the remainder is that technical term we use in ed finance education spending.
Exactly. So column E is the estimated aggregate of the total long-term ADM. So that's without any weights of the new districts. And so column F would be the estimated aggregate educational opportunity payment, or EOP. That's when you take the long-term weighted membership of the new district and multiply it against the base for fiscal year 26. And then columns G is the supplemental district spending that we referred to. Oh, and I should note that column F also contains the small and sparse school grants. So your foundation formula and the grants are all within column F. So column G is the estimated maximum supplemental district spending that this proposed district could spend at that 5% cap that's in statute. This is not the 10% transition figure or any of the other transition figures. Column H is the estimated difference between the EOP under Act 73 and aggregate ed spending. So for column H, you can think about that as the difference between columns D and F.
Mhm.
And then finally, column I is the percentage change between those two, between column F and D. So for example, just looking at new district number 1, if you look across to column H, you can see a negative 12.164 million. So that would be the difference between columns D and F. So, and then that the percentage of that would be in column I.
So with that,
Everybody.
Okay. Sorry, just a really quick question. So estimated maximum supplemental district spending is there just for us to see what that number looks like, but it's not taken into account in H, right?
correct.
Okay.
Yes, and so that shows like how much could a district put up, that what would be the maximum amount of supplemental district spending that a district could put to its voters, and its voters would have, if it's approved, then that's how much they could have. If I may, just like one other big picture caveat before getting into the weeds. There's also transition mechanisms that are included in Act 73 of like phasing from
Phasing.
education spending to education opportunity payment over a few years. That's not included here. So this does not include that phase in transition. And I know you're very patient as we walk through all of the caveats. And I want to remind folks that like I think CTE is a really helpful example of how that is one decision that would impact some of these like differences, so to speak. So we know currently education spending includes CTE in current law, right? School districts pay tuition for their CTE students, and that's built into their budget, and that's included in education spending. So we see that being included, be it that tuition that school districts are paying in CTE tuition, that's included in column D. That's the education spending of the current law. Column F, maybe it includes CTE, maybe it doesn't. We don't know because the CTE decision hasn't been made yet. And so dependent on how that decision shakes out, dependent on how school construction funding shakes out, the other pieces I know you know, that could, dependent on how that policy decision is made, could impact column F,
Mhm.
which then would impact columns H and I.
Brady.
Can I ask a clarifying question on Rep Brown's question there? So column G, the supplemental, that's based on the final 5% that we're getting to, not the phased in.
Yes. Quimby, was your question answered with special ed, or do you want to dive into more detail?
I think it's just because you see a lot of swings here when you look at the percentages down the side, but there's a lot of outstanding questions, as you say, that would really could change that quite a bit. Special ed, I thought of off the top of the head, but CTE. So we're not comparing apples. So when someone says, oh my gosh, we're dropping 17%, well, maybe not. We're going up 17%, maybe not, because there's a lot of outstanding questions.
Yeah, I think that.
It's really taking that with a grain of salt. That is very, very preliminary estimate.
Yes,
Important to remember.
I really appreciate that. And I too will say that this is what's been included so far.
Right.
So no more funding decisions were to be made, this is what the funding picture would look like.
And it doesn't include the phase-ins, which is an important thing to those that are high spenders and low spenders. There's a transition mechanism that's not included in this either.
Just going back to the point, the chair raised, so again, I know this isn't apples to apples, but I think I asked for it, and I am pushing this conversation because I think we need to be making these decisions somewhere in the produce department. And have some vague idea of what we're putting in the cart.
Eyes wide open.
It's like you might have. So sure, there's things that are not in here, but say everything stood exactly as it is now, Ms. Telvitz, District 4 is gonna lose 4%. That does not necessarily mean that their property taxes are going down 4%. They may be going down, yes, but we aren't modeling like actual property tax rates or changes, right? So the relationship, yes, the amount or the rate, you may be losing more spending than you're lowering your property tax rate. Maybe.
Vice versa.
I will say that, yes, the percentages won't directly align. Directionality and scale will. We did do, and we can pull it up or I can send it to Matt. We did do some preliminary tax rate modeling for the money committees last year. The major challenge with the tax rate modeling is we also have outstanding decisions in the tax space that we didn't talk about today. The big one being, or one of the big ones being the multipliers and the property classifications. The new property classification, that data hasn't been collected yet. So we don't even know the size of that base. So we don't know if there were to be a multiplier of 0.5 or 5 or somewhere else, how much additional revenue that would or wouldn't pull in. But yes, the communities that are currently higher spenders are going to, the way that this is currently drafted and has been modeled, will see a decrease. And there will be a corresponding decrease in their property taxes because as a higher spending district, under current law, you have a higher tax rate.
Is it long? Oh, sorry.
No. But I think it's worth stating that that is also true today. If we spend less, we have a lower tax rate. I mean, I think it's sort of sounding like, oh, that's a benefit, but we actually get that benefit always. When we spend less, we have a lower property tax rate. It's a benefit.
I can't say if it's a benefit or not.
I don't want you to say if it's a benefit or not, but if we're going to be looking at this as an offsetting response, we need to understand that it's a system that we currently live in as well. When we spend less in our current model that we have in education, we can lower our tax rates. It's a different system because it's a statewide system and it's calculated different, but it stands to reason if we spend less money, we're going to lower the property tax rates. I'm not suggesting it's a goal or not. I'm not saying anything more about it. I'm just making that statement.
I think the challenge with that is based on our statewide system. There are places who have cut spending and seen their property taxes go up.
And I actually mentioned that, the statewide system.
Right.
So Taylor.
Is it fair to say, so when we're looking at these possibly estimated decreases in spending or decreases in funding, so we'll just take the top one, like Addison, we have a negative 12%. That doesn't necessarily mean, actually, maybe that's not the best example because I'm talking more like the districts. That doesn't necessarily affect each district the same, right? Because you might have gotten put into a larger district with a district that had that funded way above a district that they're with now. So let's say, I'll just say like Milton, if Milton's going to Colchester, just totally hypothetical. Colchester might have had a whole different funding level than what Milton had. So it's not really affecting Milton as much as it would be affecting Colchester. Am I making sense?
Yes. That intuition, I think, is really hitting the nail on the head in terms of thinking about the fact that these are these aggregated impacts. So to the extent that your lower spending districts are being merged with your higher spending districts, then one of the districts in that new consolidated district would, let me restart that sentence, because you're no longer, if you're merging districts, it's no longer Milton and Colchester,
Right.
it's the Milton, Colchester, or Colchester, Milton. And the intuition is certainly true, where to the extent that you're putting together high spending districts or lower spending districts, the swings either up or down won't be as significant because they'll sort of aggregate or net out with each other. Whereas if you're going to be putting all high spending districts together, all low spending districts together, then you'll see more significant shifts. Yeah, so the intuition is absolutely.
And I would just point out, this is one of the challenges with the map that I put down, is because some districts aren't merging with anybody, which is not only that sort of balancing effect with tax impact, but it also doesn't necessarily leave, you aren't getting any more of a different mix of students with different rates that already exists in that district. And nor does it leave that district much room to maneuver in a new reality, because they aren't as large as previously conceived.
Wait, say that last part again, they're as large as what?
Because they aren't as large as conceived by, any of the previous incarnations of districts, whether it be 5 or 14 counties or 14. So I mean, yours is the perfect example, or Representative Brown's, your districts are basically wholly of themselves. You can't, not a lot of room to maneuver, to adjust, nor are you taking on a population of significantly higher rated students that would help fund more within your school district.
So I have to add then that that is the challenge in looking at, South Burlington, MMU, even if you put Burlington and Winooski together, my own district, our districts that are large or, by our standards and the things that we had before we lost them in conference in terms of goals for district sizes. The only thing they can do is reduce, there aren't right now in those places schools to close. The only in class sizes are well above in most of those cases, well above the minimums in Act 73. Many of them are creeping well above EQS right now. So the only thing you can do is cut. And so there is a leveling down potential. There is a strong, I am not seeing a clear enough evidence that there isn't a leveling down trajectory on this.
Yeah, I would say that's one of the flaws with the map, is because I created relatively small district sizes that left some current districts completely unchanged.
But that's also one of the challenges of districting and the different challenges around our state. So, okay, put CVSD and South Burlington together because they're geographically next to each other. Fine, you lose one superintendent, you combine some back office things. There are no schools to close. We're already in trailers in one school in Williston and trailers in one place in South Burlington, and South Burlington High School is crumbling. So unless we want to start merging, places that are not contiguous across the state just to lump together different economic scenarios or different places where, like that's the challenge of this redistricting exercise, is that it is not logically the same across parts of the state. And that is not because of anybody's like, but the differences are so different in different regions of the state. And the impact will be very different in different regions of the state consequentially.
Yeah. I don't want to share the opposite.
I know, and there's
perspective, because there's no
entirely
point, we've
different-
already talked about it, but I will note that the question I asked the secretary when she was sitting in the seat here, I can't remember when it was one of the times she was in, when I asked, so since her testimony was that we acknowledge there are going to be districts that will never be able to reach scale because of simple geography, it's not going to happen. So those districts will likely cost, I'm paraphrasing what I was interpreting her to say. Those districts will likely have to cost more because they have no other options, because you can't put a child on a bus for 3 hours and a half one way. And so we'll have to offset that with other districts in the state. And her answer to my question was yes. And so that's to your point. I mean,
Again, I'm
True.
not, obviously we all have our own perspective. This is we all need to be eyes wide open in the produce aisle right now. Whenever we're comparing and what we're embarking on. Yeah.
I'm agreeing and
I know.
finding out the reality of all aspects of our state.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, if we sort of accept the map that was introduced here, a couple of weeks ago at this point, as sort of like a reasonable conversation starter, which I think a lot of people agreed that it did. I mean, it's really helpful to see, like, if we take that as a starting place, I mean, this is basically as far as we come with the foundation formula. I mean, I appreciate all the caveats about why the modeling is not perfect, but I mean, this is kind of where we are. So if the recipe is incomplete, to continue the grocery cart metaphor, I mean, I think we just have to be really realistic about that. I mean, there's still a lot of outstanding policy choices and certainly arguments to be made on a lot of different sides about, are we heading in the right direction or the wrong direction? Like, what should we adjust? But I just think we have to be pretty realistic about this. This is as far as we come. And so what do we do with that? And if that fairly reasonable forecast of what a new district map might look like is what we're looking at, and we find that some of our hopes for how the numbers would sort of follow that construct, I mean, I think based on where you're sitting in this map, you're going to find that it's not really painting a picture that you're necessarily comfortable with.
Given the decisions we made.
Right. I mean, yes, not to say, we're in such a tough spot because there are so many outstanding decisions, and we can't ignore the consequences of what we may be in the process of deciding.
Further questions or comments put out there? All right, seeing none, thank you both very much for providing us with some really excellent analysis and information. Clear warnings. All right, everybody, we